Well, I want to welcome you to the second of three lectures in the Museum of Natural and Cultural History's Fall Archaeology series. I hope you'll also be here next Friday evening to hear a very dynamic Dr. Anna Roosevelt, who's a professor of anthropology at the University of Illinois at Chicago, talk about new light on the peopling of South America, which is obviously a topic with great relevance to understanding the peopling of the Americas, or North America as well. And speaking of dynamic, tonight I'm delighted to introduce Dr. Scott Fitzpatrick. He's a prodigal son of sorts who recently returned to the UO as an associate professor of anthropology. Scott finished his PhD here in archaeology at the U of O in 2003. Then he joined the faculty of North Carolina State University, where he rose to the rank of associate professor and built a truly remarkable and impressive record of research, publication, and teaching. In just the last 10 years, Scott has written or edited 6 books and published more than 80 journal articles and book chapters. And on top of that, he's also edited 7 full volumes of the Journal of Island Coastal Archaeology, which he founded, co-edited with me and now Torben Rick of the Smithsonian Institution. Recently, I think Torben and Scott and I were all at least mildly astonished when the Journal of Island and Coastal Archaeology, wow, was rated the top archaeology journal in the world. Well done, Scott. Anyway, Scott is also a rare example of a scholar who is equally at home with the archaeology and the historical ecology of both the Pacific Basin and the Caribbean. Tonight he's going to talk about his long-standing research on the beautiful Pacific islands of Palau. So please join me in welcoming one of the world's leading authorities on island and coastal archaeology, Dr. Scott Fitzpatrick. Don't let us down now.
Yeah, right. Well, thank you for coming tonight. It truly is a pleasure in many ways to be back here. As John mentioned, I finished my PhD in 2003 and had always dreamed of coming back here and finally got my chance. So it's good to see all of you here tonight. What I wanted to do tonight is talk a little bit about some research that's been ongoing ever since I was a graduate student here, in which I've continued on after. In a place that is remarkable in many ways, both archaeologically and ecologically, and is a place that's very dear to my heart because it was really the first place in the Pacific over 15 years ago that I first did archaeology. So what I'll do tonight, just to give you a brief outline, is to talk a little bit about Palau geographically and archaeologically to give you a sense of where it is and the kinds of things that we see there in prehistory. I'll go through a little bit of the chronology of Palau to set things up from a temporal perspective to give you an idea of how and when Palau was colonized relative to other islands in the Pacific. And then I'll go to the real reason, actually, I went to Palau for the first time. That's looking at a very famous exchange system that had been going on for centuries before European contact, and which was the focus of my dissertation. I'll then move on to some more intensive archaeological work that we've been doing at the Orrak Rockshelter, which is one of the most well-known sites in Palau and Micronesia for a number of different reasons, which I'll explain. And then go through some summary and conclusions about where we are right now in terms of research and where we hope to go in the near future. So for those of you who aren't familiar with Palau or Micronesia, Palau is about equidistant from New Guinea and the southern Philippines. It's located in what's referred to as the Western Caroline Islands, and is really a fairly remote place to get to, and I'll explain a little bit why that might be the case, not only in prehistory but also historically. Palau is comprised of hundreds of different islands. The largest island, Babeldaw, which is the second largest island in Micronesia, is about 150 square miles. It's mostly volcanic. And if you look at the southern part of the archipelago, you'll see a scattering of little islands, which are known colloquially as the Rock Islands. These are comprised of hundreds of different islands that look. Sorry, hundreds of different islands. Oh, that was my phone for a second. I was worried. These are very typical of the Rock Islands. So there's hundreds of these that are scattered throughout the southern part of the archipelago. These are a result of Miocene uplift of reef systems that have slowly weathered away chemically and physically over time to leave this astonishing array and beautifully organized islands. A lot of these look like broccoli from the air, these little clumps of broccoli, but if you get closer to sea level, I used to bring my kayak out in the top left there to kind of tool around in the little lagoons. They kind of look like these little, tiny little islands situated on these pedestals as they go through erosion from tidal action and other things. So you have these scattering of little islands. They're all limestone, and with limestone you get a lot of caves and rock shelters, which is one of the reasons that led me to work in this part of the Palau archipelago. Here's another example of one at high tide, and at low tide this is barely sitting up on a little pedestal of limestone and will eventually collapse and topple, and the whole process of erosion will start over again. Very few of these are inhabited today, although we have evidence in prehistory that many of them were inhabited beginning about 1,000 years ago, quite a bit after initial colonization. But most of them today have these nice beaches. People will have little summer houses, and they'll stop by on the weekends to go fishing and things like that. But most of them today are not permanently inhabited. Palau is one of the most ecologically diverse regions of the world as well. There are 3 major ocean currents that come into contact with the archipelago. It has over 1,700 species of fish and counting, which is far more than places like Hawaii. These photos I took all in the span of about half an hour during a dive, which gives you just a nice little snapshot of the kinds of organisms you see from a marine perspective. Lots of snappers and sharks and things like that. Lots of schools of fish, and there have been a number of different books, some seminal pieces written on the expertise of Palauans fishing, and it really is a strong part of their tradition over time is the exploitation of marine resources, especially fishing, but also the collection of shellfish and other types of marine organisms. So Palauans are considered to be in the Pacific some of the best fishers in the world, and we see that reflected prehistorically as well, which is something I'll talk a little bit more about. To give you an idea about the general Palauan chronology of what we know archaeologically today, up until about 10 years ago, we had thought that Palau was first colonized about 2,000 years ago. When I first began working at Orrak Rock, which is the focus of this talk tonight, we started getting back some earlier dates from burials that were found. And these went back to 2,000 plus years. And so published a short little paper that suggested Palau might have been colonized earlier. A couple of other archaeologists began coming to Palau, searching for some early sites. And now we have at least 2 major sites that date back to 3,000 to 3,300 BP. So we have a first colonization of Palau around this time. Our best guess, at least, is that it's from a Southeast Asian origin. The genetic data, the archaeological data, the linguistics all point to somewhere maybe in the southern Philippines or parts of Indonesia, but we're still trying to resolve some of those questions. Around 2400 BP in Palau, you get something that's really interesting and that is seen nowhere else really in Micronesia or for most of the Pacific, and that is the construction of earthwork terraces. And we start to see this about 2,400 years ago on the larger volcanic islands, particularly Babeldab, and there are dozens of these, and I'll show you a couple photos of those in a minute. About 700 BP, we start to see a change in settlement patterns. People who had once lived in inland areas along these terraces began to move toward the coast and built these beautifully arranged stonework foundations, pathways, docks, bathing areas, and so on. If you go to Palau today, a lot of these that were built 600 years ago, are still in use. They connect villages to each other, to the coast, and you can still walk for kilometers along these, and it's a very fascinating connection that they have made using larger stonework. About 500 BP, give or take, we start to see something else happening in Palau, which is fairly extraordinary, and that's the quarrying of stone money by islanders to the north from Yap. And this was really the focus of my dissertation, and this involved an extensive exchange network involving not only Palau and Yap, but some of the other coral atolls in western Micronesia. And then in 1783, we get the first sustained and probably the first initial European contact with Palau when the British packet, the Antelope, wrecked on the island of Oolong. This is pretty significant for a number of reasons, one of which is that Guam, which is only about 800 miles north of Palau, was the first Micronesian island, the first Pacific island, that was contacted by Europeans when Magellan landed there in 1521. And Palau, which is relatively close, and a lot of other islands, including Yap, were contacted by the Spanish in the early to mid-1500s. But it took quite a long time for anyone to find Palau. And in fact, one of the names for Palau, according to Europeans, was the Enchanted Islands, because the Spanish kept trying to find them, and despite repeated attempts, were never able to, despite a dozen or more attempts from Guam and the Philippines to do so. So we'll get to that as well. To give you a little idea about what the chronology looks like and where we find these sites, Oolong Island, which also happens to be where the British Antelope wrecked, has dates going back to at least 3100 BP, if not a little earlier. This is a rock island that's on the western part of the archipelago. El Orrak, which means beach of Orrak, Orrak Island. We have dates going back to 3000 to 2700 BP, so about contemporaneous with Oolong. I suspect that maybe some of these dates could be pushed back a little earlier, and if so, would make this one of the earliest burial sites, or the earliest in the Pacific. These are some of the human-constructed terraces that we get in Palau, starting about 2400 BP. There's been a lot of discussion about whether these are agricultural, whether they're defensive, whether they are part of more of a domestic kind of activity versus something ritual, let's say. Nonetheless, they're very impressive. They have a lot of different types of styles. Some are ringed with ditches. Some have these larger berms put around them. And I think the consensus, mostly by people working in Palau and the rest of Micronesia, is that these are largely defensive in nature. There doesn't seem to be anything pointing to agricultural use of these. Then we have these stonework villages. Along with these stonework villages, you get some really interesting and beautiful architecture, including this Palauan Bai, which is on the bottom left. Let's see. Yeah, bottom left. I can't use my pointer here. This is a men's clubhouse. Women also had their own variety of these. You can see some of these stone pathways. People built their houses on these stone platforms, but a very impressive array of domestic architecture. And then beginning about 500 BP, you get this stone money quarrying. And really, this is, I can't really talk about working at this site without providing a little bit of a narrative about what brought me here and why this site is so important. When I began working in Palau in 1997, I first went out to this site on the top left, which is called Maturabis. And they were developing the site as part of an eco-tourist attraction. I really didn't know much about stone money other than what I had maybe read in National Geographic at that point. I was a first-year doctoral student here at U of O. And so I went with some of the Palauan staff from the Bureau of Arts and Culture to monitor this site, and we went up to see how they were doing, and as they were building all these railings and things. And I saw this piece of stone money sitting there, and I asked them about it, and they told me the story of how people from Yap came to Palau to carve these limestone discs and then bring them back to Yap in various exchange networks. And I was obviously entranced by this. This piece of stone money looked extremely large and heavy. It was also in the inland part of this island, which was karst, so it's very jagged stone, and just on the surface looked like a tremendous engineering feat. And I obviously wanted to do more. I was looking for a dissertation project, and voila, there it was. So really, to give you some background of what this meant in terms of the archaeology of Palau and also my research, we have these two island groups, Palau and Yap, which began to become involved in this exchange system. So the Yapese would come down to Palau. They would carve these pieces of stone money and then bring them back on raft or canoe or some other type of ship. Europeans eventually became involved in this exchange system, helping the Yapese do a lot of this work. And as I began working through my dissertation, found some really neat photographs dating to the South Seas expedition in the early 1900s, right about the time this ended, but showing clearly Yapese working on some of these islands, carving the stone money, building bamboo scaffolding. On the top right, we see some structures that were probably built for bringing rafts or boats in to lay these on to bring back to Yap. And I'll say too that this is an open ocean voyaging of several hundred miles back to Yap. And one of the reasons why the Spanish weren't able to contact Palau until very late is because these ocean currents and winds are so challenging to seafarers. And so I began to think too, well, I mean, this is really an interesting aspect of Palauan prehistory going into the historic period. How really did they manage getting these huge stones back? When I began to visit Yap and look more into the ethnography, it was equally interesting. We see in Yap, if you go today, these are more recent photos. They would place these pieces of stone money along stone pathways leading to villages. They would prop them up in front of houses. But very significant cultural icons to the Yapese. There's lots of variations of these, but most of them are circular or ovoid in shape. They have a hole through the center, and if you look through the ethnography, they talk about a sailor from Yap named Nagumang, who came to Palau and found this beautiful crystalline stone in one of the caves. He carved one in the shape of a fish that seemed to be a little difficult to transport and carry, and so he looked up at the sky, saw the full moon, and decided to carve these in the shape of the moon. They would then perforate the center in order to help carry them, although many of these weigh so much that the hole seems to have just been used as a matter of convention rather than as something very functional. You can see this one right here. I'm 5'10", give or take. This one is about 6.5 feet tall and weighs several metric tons. And you see hundreds of these around Yap. During the Japanese administration in the 1930s, they counted about 13,000 of them. Here is one of my colleagues from the Yap Historic Preservation Office at one of the dancing grounds, one of the more famous sites in Yap known as Manyol, where there's hundreds of these. Some variations. This one has 2 holes in it. Some of them also are carved in sort of this gradation, this stepped gradation, but most of them follow this kind of single perforation convention. This really is part of the cultural identity of the Yapese. They pride themselves on the fact that they were engaged in this exchange system with Palau. It's instantly recognizable, and if you go to major museums all over the world, you'll usually find a piece of stone money that was brought in at some point. You see in the late 1800s, European explorers coming in and seeing the Yapese coming to Palau and carrying these off in rafts. But right around this time, we also get Europeans becoming involved in this venture. What Europeans recognized early on when they began talking to the Yapese about this was that they were extremely valuable to them for many reasons. And this was dependent on a number of different variables: the size and the shape, the quality of the stone was important, the risk involved. And so they recognized this as a very risky endeavor. It helped increase the value of certain pieces of stone. There's even a piece of stone money in Yap that they call Rai no Barag, and Rai is the Yapese name for stone money, and it means the stone without tears, because nobody died or was injured bringing this back. There's also apparently a piece of stone money that's underwater in Yap, somewhere along the coral reef, that was lost but was particularly valuable and is still exchanged today through oral traditions, although nobody has seen it for over 100 years. They have a strong oral history attached to these, so when they were brought to Yap, they weren't often moved. Limestone, in this case calcite, is a very fragile stone, although it's very heavy, and they really didn't want to risk moving it. So it would exchange hands through a number of different means, used in various social transactions, including if somebody gave birth to a child, you might give one as a present. At the name-giving ceremony, which is important in Yap, they might receive some stone money from their friends or family. If somebody adopted a child, they were given that by the child's extended family. Marriage, sometimes securing allies. Ransom of a corpse. If you were engaged in some sort of conflict and wanted to get somebody back, you might give a piece of stone money. And also occasionally, although pretty infrequently, for a loan or promise. And in some cases, if you were in dire straits, you might exchange a piece of stone money for something that you really needed if you had a crop failure or something. So we have this exchange system going on, and as I began reading a lot of the ethnohistory, we have a character that comes out of the woodwork here, known as Captain David Dean O'Keefe. He was an American sailor, and in about 1880, 1881, he was working in the shipyards of Savannah, Georgia, and he was known for his fiery temper. He was an Irishman. And he was on the docks one day, and there was a drunk, insubordinate sailor, and he cracked him across the jaw. The sailor fell into the water, and he was afraid that he was going to be arrested for killing this person. He was pretty sure he had killed him. So he jumped on the next ship out of Savannah, which is called the Belvedere, leaving behind his wife, Catherine, and a newly born daughter, and jumped ship and left, ended up in the Pacific. As the story goes, the Belvedere wrecked. He washed ashore on Yap and spent quite a few months debating what he would do. And at that time, he saw the Yapese engaged in bringing these stone money discs back from Palau, and he had an idea. And so he jumped on a German steamer, went to Hong Kong, and when he got there, he began trying to figure out a way to get back to Yap, but with a ship. And he befriended a dentist who, in Hong Kong, who he came to like, and he got a loan to buy a Chinese junk, one of those ships. So he sailed it back to Yap, and he told the Yapese, listen, if you guys harvest copra or coconut meat for me, I will bring you to Palau, and I'll bring your stone money back. And they thought this was a great idea. Copra at that time and coconut oil was as good as gold. It was sold in Asian markets for a very high price, and the Germans especially had been on Yap and other parts of Micronesia desperately trying to get indigenous groups to get them copra, throwing trinkets at them and other things, and they weren't falling for it. But O'Keefe had an idea, and his idea literally led him to become a multimillionaire in 1880s dollars. So he began doing this, and for a period of almost 20 years, went back and forth, bringing the Yapese to Palau, bringing the stone money back, and as a result, the stone money got bigger and bigger, and it became more nicely made, very smooth, very symmetrical, and so you can today go and see pieces of stone money and recognize that it was carved with metal tools versus traditional tools made out of stone or shell. So he began doing this. He married a Yapese woman. They had 5 children. He named his boat the Catherine after his wife that he had left, and he sent remittances back to her as well from his profits, but he never went back. He was encountered by another German officer who was coming through Yap. This is in the early 1900s. The German officer did not like the fact that O'Keefe had his own island in Yap, that he had his own flag, and he told him to take the flag down. O'Keefe proceeded to knock him out, punching him in the face, He knew he was going to be court-martialed and probably hung, so he left with 3 of his sons on a ship and was never seen again. So that was the end of O'Keefe's tale, but a very fascinating story of Europeans becoming involved in an exchange system that ultimately transformed how they did things and what they did. This is one of the few photographs of stone money being placed on a European ship. You can count a number of different Yapese there. You can kind of see their hair bundled up with a hairpin poking through it. And then in the yellow, I suspect is O'Keefe, but I can't be positive. But somebody wearing a white suit. Okay. We see them coming to Palau, and one of the things that I was interested in wondering is how did the Yapese how did the Yapese convince the Palauans to be able to let them do that? To the Palauans, limestone was nothing. They were surrounded by it. They could have cared less about it. But the Palauans, as savvy as they are politically, and they were back then, I suspect as well, recognized that they could get something out of it. And so they used the Yapese as corvée labor. In fact, there's a lot of Palauan villages that have Yapese cognate names to them. They're basically Yapese names, and what they were probably doing is letting the Yapese live in these villages and basically making them build a lot of the infrastructure that you see today. They also were exchanging these beads, which are known as udod. These are Palauan women's money. Some of these are glass, which you'd only see historically, and so even though there's not a lot of evidence for this, I suspect that the Yapese, as they were very good navigators and had a good exchange system themselves with coral atoll dwellers who were very good seafarers, probably ventured to places like the Philippines to get things that the Palauans wanted in exchange for access to the quarry sites for limestone. So that led me to develop my dissertation project in Palau, looking at several different quarry sites. This is one of the few pieces of stone money that's actually not broken in Palau. We've identified a number of different quarry sites, 3 major ones, some ancillary ones as well, and then occasionally a scattered piece of stone money that you'll find on a rock island somewhere. This is one of the few, and this is also on Orrak Island, which I'll be talking a little bit more about. Apparently, when a piece of stone money broke during either transport or production, they would leave it there. There was never really any discernible attempt to winnow it down, to make it smaller. It's as if they had this preconceived notion of what this piece of stone money should look like, and then eventually just ended up leaving it there if it cracked or broke. And in fact, of the 15 or so pieces of stone money we have in Palau, this is the only one that's this size that's unbroken. Some smaller ones, but this is the largest. So I began going to these sites, surveying and mapping a lot of them. We see some smaller unfinished ones at the top. The one on the bottom left is still encased in this huge piece of flowstone that had been dropping from the ceiling. And then on the bottom right, it's a little harder to see, but this is a piece that's about 3.5 meters across, that's broken and sitting on a slope against a tree. So a lot of these unfinished are broken. Here's another one. It's one of the few found in the southern Rock Islands. This is on Carp Island. You can just get a scale for how big that is. And even during historic times, would have been quite a monumental effort to shimmy this onto some kind of raft or watercraft, even just to get out to, even if it was one of O'Keefe's ship, out to a lagoon where he could actually leave. So what I did is I began to work at several different quarry sites. On the inset here, you see Omis Cave. That was the first one I began working at in 1999. Matukrabis, and then El Orrak. So I first worked at Omis Cave in 1999, went to Matukrabis and Orrak Island in 2000, and it was in kind of a strange and good turn of events. We began working at Matukrabis I had a small army of Oregon undergraduate anthropology majors with me at the time. And Matukrabis, as I wasn't aware at the time, had a lot of chiggers. And so we would go up to the site. We also had to wet screen, and we'd have to carry up water from the ocean, a 10-minute walk each way up these karstic slopes. So it was quite an effort. And after about 2 weeks, we were getting so bit with chiggers that I was about to have a mutiny on my hands. The students definitely weren't enthused about going there in the mornings, and so at that point we had collected enough data. We did a lot of mapping, and I said, let's go to Orrak. Let's finish up the last month and a half of our project and go here. And I wasn't that excited about it initially because it wasn't as interesting of a site, but I sort of kowtowed a little bit and said, all right, let's try this. Just to give you a sense of some of the architecture as we go along here, the Yapese were very proficient at building things that allowed them to move stone money. So we often see stone docks coming out of the coastal sites. The docks are always above. When the tide goes up, they're always submerged. So what I think they probably were doing are rolling these out or lifting these discs out, putting them on a raft and waiting for the tide to come up, and then they kind of scoot them out into the lagoon. We get a lot of unfinished pieces as I began working. A lot of these still embedded in flowstone formations. Even subsurface, we began to find architecture as well. On the bottom right here, this is at that Mutukarabi site, we get some stone foundations that have now been covered. Lots of limestone debitage showing up. So one of the things that I began to do too, just to sort of see the process of manufacture of this, is it had been reported in literature that a lot of this stone was different kinds of stones. Some people refer to it as sandstone, aragonite, calcite. And so when I was here, we did some X-ray fluorescence on the stone. We found out that it was calcite. But one of the interesting things that I noticed was on the debitage, and we would get tens of thousands of pieces of this debitage, and I almost had a mutiny after that for my students too, after having to measure all those and weigh them. But you could categorize these into primary, secondary, and tertiary, and you could still see a lot of the gouge marks. You could see the crystals, how they were crushed. You could see these macroscopically, but very visible under the microscope. So we developed a sequence of how these were produced over time. And we also found the only metal tools associated with any quarry site during excavation, and so we had a pretty good idea of when they were quarried and the different steps of manufacture that they would have taken, and published a paper in Historical Archaeology on the significance of these tools to Palauans. To give you another little sense here of just how extraordinary this whole exchange system was. This is the first piece I ever saw. It is about 3 meters across. It's half a meter thick at the center, and it's 30 centimeters thick at the edge. If you do your little equation, the specific gravity of a calcite, radius square times pi times length, width, height, blah, 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 you come to an answer of 7.5 metric tons. This is broken. They left it there, but is by no means the largest piece known. There is one in Yap today that is about 4 meters, 4.2 meters in diameter, but nobody is allowed to visit. It's on its own little island, and outsiders are not allowed to visit, so I've never seen it. But there are many this size and larger that are found in Yap. To put that in perspective, it's sort of like taking 2 little cars and putting those on a raft or even some type of scaffolding and trying to shimmy it down this rocky island to the shore, putting it on a boat, navigating through a shallow lagoon, getting it out into open ocean, and then getting it 280 some miles to your destination, and then bringing it off and putting it in your village. So this really was, even during the historic period, quite an ordeal. So what we see here is all these quarry sites, including Orrak, that are used to bring stone money back, and a lot of these are found in the southeast portion of Babeldaub in the Rock Islands, and this, I think, allowed them to get out to the open ocean a little more easily. During certain times of the year, you have good winds and currents that come up that would have allowed them to travel more safely, and in fact, there is a village in the northern part of Babeldaub called Chelechol, where a farmer found 8 pieces of stone money buried as if they were just leaving them there, kind of, storing them there for the winds and currents to come up before bringing them back to Yap. Chelechol is also a Yapese word. So that brings us to Orrak, and this was really the final stage of my dissertation research, but also the focus of other types of projects since then. So Orrak Island, a small little limestone island off the southeast coast of Babeldaub. It's connected by a prehistoric causeway that's about 50, 60 meters in length. So people built this to be able to walk out to the island from the Big Island. So it's really not that far away, but you have to get there by boat today. So Orrak has a couple major sites, the one which we worked at, but also one in the interior called Upper Orrak, and you saw some of the pieces of stone money came from that particular location. So here's what El Orrak looks like as you come in by boat. This dock at the bottom is brand new. They just built this a couple years ago, which has really changed the flow of water around the site. So previously it was all covered in mangrove. Today it's sort of a small sand flat. But the site, the rock shelter itself, is kind of in this area behind these trees. This gives you a perspective of looking sort of northeast. We worked on excavations here beginning in 2000. We went back in 2002. We then went back for a Discovery Channel show in 2007, and then did another field season this last summer, along with Greg Nelson, who's been working with me on some of the human remains. The excavation itself has mostly focused along the center of the rock shelter, and so when we began working here, we have a couple pieces of stone money. We have some stone architecture. It's really what drew me to the site. And so as we began excavating deeper in some smaller one-by-one test units, we began to come up with lots of what looked like occupation refuse. So shellfish, fish remains, shark, stingray, these kinds of things. Very typical of what you'd find if somebody was using this as a temporary campsite. And we began to go deeper and deeper, and as we hit about 50 centimeters, we ran into this very nice coral sand. Sand looks just like what it is out in front of the site. And we then began to run into these big limestone rocks. And at first I thought it was sealing rockfall that had come down. But as we began to remove those and excavate a little deeper, we began to run into human remains. This was something I had not expected at all. One of my Palauan colleagues started to uncover some legs and then a skull, and we stopped the project and we brought in the Bureau of Arts and Culture, and we consulted with them, and I said, listen, it's the last week of the project, right? You always run into human remains the last day or the last week or the tail end of your project. It certainly happened here. And I said, listen, my first guess is that they might be Yapese, but I don't know. They might be Palauan. What should we do? And they said, well, go ahead and continue excavation, recover as much as you can, and we'll get some radiocarbon dates and do some other things to see how old they are and whether they might be related to Palauans or Yapese. So we began to work a little bit more, and we also began to uncover a lot of really interesting artifacts, things that we hadn't really seen in Palau before. These are photographs all from this last field season. So it's just a little tiny snapshot of a lot of the artifacts we have, but we find bone needles, ornaments, little like beads and things made out of bone occasionally, lots of shell tools, scraping tools. On the top right, that's a shellfish hook made out of trochus. This was the first fish hook that we had found, and we ended up finding, was it 2 others on top of this? Great. Yeah, I found 2 or 3 this last field season, and we hadn't found any previously. We get some shell adzes. The one on the bottom right is made out of pearl shell. It's what we call a scraper grater. The top edge there is serrated purposefully, and these are a form of women's money referred to as SU. These are only carried by women. They're also a tool, and we got some dates on these that go back to almost 2,000 years ago. These are recorded ethnographically as also being a form of women's money and as being a woman's tool, and these are only found, when we find them in situ with burials, they're only found with females. So this sort of cultural tradition goes back quite a ways. Some other various types of shell and bone ornaments and beads. We find the top ones are probably spacer beads for longer strands, like 3 or 4 strands that they would use so they wouldn't get all tangled up. We also see those recorded ethnographically. And then going up into the late historic, prehistoric period. So glass beads. The top left is actually a small piece of stone money that we found buried in the sand when we started this last summer, which was very cool to find, and it was even better that the only Palauan student I had on my project was the one that found it. We get lots of faunal remains. Lots of fish taxa, over 25 different discrete fish taxa in tropical environments, and Palau is no exception to this, especially with its diversity. We have a really hard time narrowing it down to species or even genera in some cases. Almost 100 shellfish taxa. Just during the first year of excavation that I did there, because it was such a unique site, I had students work with me to analyze the whole shellfish assemblage, which is only from about 1.5 cubic meters of soil altogether, and it took us about 4 years to do all that. But we have a really good, really good collection. When you look at the fishing, we've published a couple different papers on this, the most recent one in Archaeology and Oceania last year. We have analyzed altogether over 28,000 fish bones. That doesn't include this last field season, from about a cubic and a half meter of soil, and we get a pretty good collection. And when you look at the number of fish through time and the different taxa, fishing is definitely declining. We see fish declining by an order of magnitude as you go through time post-burial activity. And so this was kind of interesting to me too, and we were wondering why this might be the case, but this also coincides with people moving from the inland parts of Palau down to the coast, and engaging in increasing amounts of agriculture, particularly taro. When we have analyzed the mollusks, we're just about ready to finish this paper, but we have over 44 families from 95 different taxa, over 16,000 individuals. That's out of like 40,000 fragments. Most of these are dominated by these 2 species right here, Mactra shells and Strombus gibberellus. This is the humped conch, and this is one of the more common shellfish species that are found in Palauan archaeological sites. We've run all the stats, and we're seeing an increasing dominance of shellfish as fishing declines. So they're making up their protein by consuming more shellfish and decreasing their fishing activities. One of the things that I was interested too as we went through the shellfish analysis was there had been a study done on looking at this species of shell, Strombus gibberellus, in a southern site in the archipelago. And they looked at, I think, a few hundred, found a correlation through time, through a narrow range of time, about 500 years, of these becoming larger. And they, becoming smaller. And so this other study was arguing that there was some type of resource depression during this interval of time. And so I had some students go ahead and measure a much more robust sample, over 1,400 of them, and this was a longer temporal time frame, of 3,000 years ago up to almost historic contact. And what we found is there was a significant increase through time instead, which was I was sort of curious about. This was very contrary to other studies that had been done on this species elsewhere in the Pacific. And so we were kind of wondering why this might be the case. Well, in the southern lagoon, where they found decrease in size, there wasn't a lot of agriculture going on. And because Orrak is so closely connected to Babbeldaub, where they were practicing a lot of agriculture, one of the ideas we came up with, and I think it makes fairly good sense, is that you're seeing increasing agricultural production through time. And as you get that, you're also seeing increasing erosion along the coast and sedimentation in the lagoon right in front of Orrak. And so I suspect that if you're getting a lot of nutrient load into the waters, and these are gastropods, which are very good at living in this kind of environment, that over time, even though they were being harvested fairly significantly by humans, that their size was actually getting larger because the environment was much more conducive to their maturity and growth. And that brings us to the human burials as we got a little deeper. We have a good sequence of radiocarbon dates, about 35 from the site, about 15, 16 are from human burials. And as we continued research on the site, it became clear that this was a huge cemetery. The minimum number of individuals we have thus far is about 35, although some of those are fragments. We have about 50 boxes that are now going to be shipped from Palau this coming week. A lot of those are human remains we excavated this past summer. We'll combine all of these with the previous assemblages, but what it looks like is that Orrak follows a similar pattern as other rock island caves or rock shelters in other parts of Palau, where they're used for burying the dead. It's not unusual to go into a cave in the Rock Islands and find human remains. In fact, almost every sizable cave or rock shelter I've been in Palau, I've seen human remains either lying on the surface or eroding out of a subsurface context. And so we have here the earliest form of mortuary behavior that really coincides with the first, 10 or so generations of Palauan colonization. This is, because of the dates, is by far the earliest burial site in Micronesia. There's only one other site in the Pacific that is this old. It might be just a little older on Vanuatu at the Teouma site. These are those pearl shell scraper graters I was talking about earlier. We found these in association with two burials for sure, and fragments of these artifacts scattered around in the sand. But the ones that we have found, one individual had 3 stacked on top of each other. The other one had 2, all found above the proximal end of the left femur. And so what I think they probably were, they were in a pouch of some sort, and just that decomposed, and the shell tools were left. But very cool that they're found only with females, which kind of falls in line with what you see at historic contact of what women were using and trading and making as tools. Going back to going on in terms of continued research at the site, in 2007, I did an episode of Bone Detectives for the Discovery Channel, and we continued excavation at the site. We were mostly interested in the human burials, and one of the things that we found, and we found this live on camera, which is, it wasn't a prop or wasn't made up. As we began excavating, I was taking the sand out of the skull on the bottom right, and carefully removing it out, and I saw this sort of white thing inside. And I thought it was a pearl shell scraper, like ones we had found and just been sort of moved in there. And as we took it out, it was the complete frontal bone of a 2-year-old child. Bleached white, very different color than what was found. And so Greg and I published a paper arguing that this was purposeful. It was something that was put in there purposefully later on after that individual had been buried. essentially the site has so many people in it. We've only excavated a small portion of it, but they really are sort of stacked like cordwood in no discernible pattern. There's not a pattern of the head being oriented in any sort of cardinal direction. They all tend to be sort of buried, lying in a supine position, oftentimes with their arms across their lap. But in terms of orientation and other things, really no huge pattern to that. Here's a good example of what one of these looks like. Not too many complete ones. We do have the occasional skull, the occasional series of articulated bones, but this is probably the result of an older burial being impacted by somebody putting in a new one. So just in summary of what we found in terms of mortuary behaviors, we have about 35 people at the site, both sexes, all ages. We even have found neonate bones of children that hadn't even been born yet. Maybe the mother died in childbirth or was some form of miscarriage. Most are buried in a supine position, really no distinct pattern. We see this repetitive burial activity that takes place, and it's going over a span, as far as I can tell, of at least 1,000 years, maybe a little bit more, until burial activity ceases. There's sort of this interval of time where nothing seems to be going on, and then there's this temporary occupation where we start to see all these faunal remains and things. One of the other side notes to this is that pretty much all of the adult teeth are red. They're stained red from chewing betel nut. And this is a phenomenon that we had looked at before. The adolescent teeth don't have them. This kind of falls in a pattern, too, of Palauan families restricting their children, for the most part, in chewing betel nut until they reach adulthood. But pretty much all of the teeth have betel nut staining, and it's not purposeful staining. It's just a residual effect from your saliva becoming red from chewing the betel nut and staining it permanently if you're not brushing your teeth. We've published a number of different papers over the years on this, including the first synopsis of the burial activity in anthropological science back in 2006, and then Greg and I published a summary looking at the mortuary behaviors through time. And you get some very distinct patterns and changes, but the burial of individuals in these limestone caves and rock shelters is the earliest, and if you look at the earliest radiocarbon dates, it really just doesn't fall that much after initial settlement by humans. One of the other smaller studies we've done, and we're planning on continuing this, but because the site was used not really as occupation during the burial episodes, but just as a place for interring the dead, we were interested in finding what their diets were like. And so we did stable isotope analysis of carbon and nitrogen, and we can see, depending on how you compare the bone collagen and between the two and other isotopic data, we can get a fairly good idea of the percentage of food they were eating that was marine versus terrestrial, let's say. So when we look at this from the sample that we used, and we used 3 different sites in Palau, some from Orrak, some from the island of Peleliu in the south, just one actually from Peleliu, and we weren't actually sure if this was prehistoric or not. It was found by a Japanese team that was looking for KIAs from World War II, and so they thought it was prehistoric, but they weren't sure, and I suspect now that it's not. And then a couple from from a quarry site on the island of Koror, which was prehistoric and dates a little bit after Orrak. So we see that the Orrak individuals fall higher up on the trophic level, pretty high marine consumption, which we would expect. And then when we compare this with other just sites that have good isotopic data, we see that Palau basically falls on one end of the spectrum, and significantly, if you look at the black squares there, those are from the Marianas, like Guam and Rota and Tinian, pretty different than what you see in another Micronesian island archipelago. So this is just the beginning of the study. We have better radiocarbon dates from a lot of these individuals, and we'll be doing more of this to kind of narrow down whether there are any differences between males and females, for example. In terms of radiocarbon chronology, again, we have lots and lots of radiocarbon dates from this site as well as some other sites I worked on. We have a pretty good sense of when stone money began, and then when we see the first colonization of Palau. And you'll see a couple of these dates that fall below 3000 BP. These are all from bone dates at Orrak, and I got a couple back early on that were around 4000, but I suspect that the pretreatment procedures for the samples wasn't that great, and all subsequent dates I've sent to other labs have come back around 3000 to 2700 at the earliest or so. Right here. But nonetheless, Orrak was really the first site in Palau to have a pre-2000 BP date to it, and now a sequence of dates. It is, again, the earliest site in Palau, the earliest burial site in Micronesia, and depending on more of the dates, could be the earliest burial site in the Pacific Islands. Just to conclude a lot of what I've gone over in some of the future research that we hope to do, it's really, Orrak is significant for a number of reasons, but this is just one of many Rock Island cemeteries or traditional villages that are scattered around the Palau and Rock Islands. We've only just touched the surface of finding and recording a lot of these. Nonetheless, Orrak is really one of the longest continually used sites in Palau. It has a really nice array of artifacts and remains to give us an idea about the subsistence. Really dense midden, lots of different fish and shellfish going on past 1800 BP, really nice collection of artifacts. And then we get stone money quarrying that's being done there with historic influence later on. So we have these, very distinct stages of use of this site, very multi-component. And I don't know of a site in Micronesia that has this kind of array with such exceptional preservation. Some of the future research that we'd like to do we're in the beginning stages of getting samples for more paleodietary information. We also would like to do some strontium isotope analysis. Because the dates are so early and because we have such a large collection of human remains, we'd like to get a better idea of whether these are all individuals that were coming from the same part of Palau, whether some of those might have been migrants from other places. That might tell us a little bit about how relatively isolated Palau was in prehistory. We haven't attempted yet to do ancient DNA, but we're exploring that now. And then we're continuing on with a lot of the skeletal analysis that we started over 10 years ago. So I'd like to thank everyone who's helped me kind of along the way. The list is pretty numerous, and I haven't put individuals in there for that reason, but a lot of the initial support, both psychologically and financially and so on, I owe to the Department of Anthropology here and John and Madonna, who are on my committee, so thank you very much. As well as several different funding agencies who saw merit in the work that we've done over the past 15 years or so. And again, to the museum for inviting me here tonight. So thank you very much.
We have time for a few questions if anybody has them. For Scott?
First, thank you very much for your talk. It was very interesting, informative, I thought. Anyway, my question is, when you look at a lot of historical cases, like the Spanish gold, the gold coming from Americas, and the Chinese silver coming from foreign trade, that's usually associated a lot of social transformation. Sometimes it's negative one, like the increase in the inflation and so on. Do you see any social implications like that from the the trade between the Palau and the Japanese society with the stone quarrying?
Okay, so the question was, do we see any type of social transformations happening when these connections start taking place between? Yeah, to a certain extent. So when the Yapese began coming into Palau, and I don't know if initially it was for stone money. I suspect there were probably some connections, and you do see some similarities in architecture between the two, and sometimes artifacts and other things. Although there's some stark differences between those as well. Some of the major social differences you see are, I think to look at the story from a broader perspective, the Yapese were also engaged in an exchange network with a lot of the coral atoll dwellers. And so these coral atoll dwellers were coming to Yap as part of what was called the Sawe exchange system. And the coral atoll dwellers were very subservient to the Yapese. The Yapese were sort of the parents, and the atoll dwellers were sort of the children, and that's how they referred to themselves in part of this exchange system. And I think that when the Yapese began to have an interest in Palau, particularly as it pertains to stone money, that they were put into a position that they hadn't been to before, which was to be subservient to another larger group. And I think that socially you're seeing some changes at historic contact that reflect some of that. And it's hard to pin it down, and archaeologically it's not very visible to a great extent, but the ethnographic descriptions and some of the ethnohistory regarding Europeans coming in and helping Palauans and Yapese do this really elevated the status of the Yapese after so many centuries of sort of being subservient, right? They had now Europeans on their side, one in particular who was helping them do this. And I think it sort of balanced things out a little bit more, much to the Palauans' chagrin. And they talk a little bit about that in oral histories too. So the Europeans coming in drastically changed, I think, it sort of leveled the playing field a little bit in that regard. And it was something the Yapese, I think, were very, very happy about in general.
Wondering about the functions of the holes in the middle of the money. I mean, would it be partly to help transport as far as the rollers?
Yeah. So when you look at the ones that were obviously made with more traditional tools, the holes themselves are sort of biconical. They're smaller in the center, and they kind of get big, right, and they're very roughly hewn. When you look at the historic ones and ones that are at sites that were used historically for stone money, it's almost as if they took a drill press and just went right. I mean, it's very smooth, very, very nicely done. The holes themselves, I think, were functional at the beginning. It just made it easier to carry, and I showed a picture from the 1960s of the Yapese still doing this, kind of putting this timber through it and carrying it with a few individuals. But some of them are so large, and if you consider the stature of the Yapese, who on average I think are probably around 5 feet tall, that doesn't really make a whole lot of sense. And some of them are so big anyway, and once you approach, if you look at experimental studies of megaliths around the world, once a stone approaches about 5 metric tons, it doesn't matter how many people you have, you just can't lift it and move it very well. You have to put it on some kind of roller or some kind of armature or something. And so I think they were still doing it, but they had just been doing it for centuries that it just, why change it? It was just, they wanted those to look just like all of the other ones, and that's what they had been doing. There's really, and rolling it, which had been proposed by some archaeologists, I think would have, even for smaller ones, wouldn't have made that much sense because the stone just chips so easily, and would have cracked, I think, if they had tried to do that. And it would have been impossible in these karst islands. It's just, it's so jagged that you fall once and it just cuts you to ribbons. And I think that probably a lot of people were injured even just doing it the regular way. By sort of putting it in an armature perhaps, or sliding it down on rollers.
Edward? Well, I have a couple of questions related to the geology. I guess it's interesting to me that they're going all the way to get these stones. I guess it must mean that Yap doesn't
Well, you're right. Yap doesn't have any substantial limestone deposits, although there is. I was working with a geologist that had visited Yap, and she had recorded not a lot, but a few pieces of stone money that were made with local materials in Yap, including schist in one and a marble in another one. But those would have been much more difficult to carve and to shape in this sort of circular motif than any of the other stones that Yappies had. And so you're right. I mean, the geology throughout Micronesia, a lot of it's coral atolls. But it's only when you get sort of this uplifted coral reef system where you're getting limestone deposits from chemical and physical weathering where you're starting to get flowstone, stalactites and stalagmites. So there aren't very many places in Micronesia where you get that. Guam is another one. And there had actually been some ethnohistory suggesting that the Yappies started going to Guam to do it, but they didn't really have a very good relationship with indigenous Chamorro. So Palau was really the easiest, I think, place to go to get the stone. And I think initially the Palauans and Yappies had a fairly cordial relationship for the most part, although the Palauans, I think, took advantage of it. But it was a matter of convenience, and it was really the only place that they had relatively close access to do this. So it was more of just a matter of convenience, and because it was the only place that really had that kind of quality stone. Not all limestone and not all calcite is equally good as well, and so you can see where they're purposefully targeting pretty substantial portions of limestone, knocking away chunks of them off to see what the stone looks like inside. And there are qualities in there. I mean, these look, sort of gray or black now, but these, when they're first made, are this milky, crystalline, right? I mean, when the sun comes out, they're just beautiful. I mean, they'll blind you. They're so bright white. And so they definitely were looking for good, quality stone that had those characteristics, and Palau has just an abundance of it. So.
Right. And that was another thing I was going to ask about is, so they're targeting flowstone particularly. I guess the coral, when it's originally deposited, doesn't have the right qualities to make these things. It has to go through the karst process before you get that crystalline.
Right, okay. Right. So you'll see some, if you go, even at sites that aren't, used for quarries, throughout the Rock Islands, you get some pretty substantial pillars of flowstone or walls that are completely flowstone, and good choice stone for them to use, but fairly common.
Yeah. You talked about the Palau and women's money. What did the men use?
So the question was, I talked a little bit about Palau and women's money. What did the men use? The men used the money that the women gave them, I think, still like today. Palauan, I think it was very similar. I mean, Palauan men on the surface hold a lot of the political positions, but really, for the most part, that's kind of on the surface. Women hold a lot of the power and control in Palauan society. Even if you look at it historically, it's women's groups who are the authority. They're the ones who make the big decisions on what families or extended families do. And even today, every 2 weeks on Friday is payday for pretty much everyone in Palau. And there's only 15,000 Palauans that live there. But the men, have their paychecks deposited, and the women give them money to go out with their friends. It's not uncommon. It's and I really suspect that's what it was 3,000 years ago.
A little bit about the similarities and differences between Palauan and Yappies burial sites, if you found them on Palau, and how you tell them apart.
So the question was, what are the differences between Yappies and Palauan burial sites? I'm sorry? And similarities. I can't answer that question because there have been no Yappies burials recovered. It's a volcanic island. Preservation is extremely poor. and I know of no human burials intact that have been recovered. There is the isolated skeletal fragment that's been found, but very little archaeology on Yap. In fact, the earliest dates we have for Yap are 2,000 years old, which is much different than Palau too. I think maybe it could be pushed back a little earlier in time, but the archaeology of Yap is very poorly understood in general. So.
The terraces that you showed from the Palau, the terraces.
The larger terraces,
yeah.
huh?
And do they serve any use for the current society in that island?
So the question was, do the terraces serve any sort of function to current society? They do only in the respect that they are tourist attractions. The Japanese the Palauans up until recently thought they were remnants of mining by the Japanese, because there were some bauxite mines, and there are a couple of bauxite mines that are not active any longer, but look like the sort of stepped gradations on hillsides. And so most Palauans didn't even think they were prehistoric or that they were connected to them. But that's changing a little bit. There have been a few different archaeologists that have done research on some of the terraces, but really not a lot of work actually either. I'm only really one of maybe 3 archaeologists that have worked there fairly consistently over the last 20 years. And so it was, it's very, very little is still known about those. Other than there have been some paleo-environmental data that's been collected. They've tried to look at pollen cores and things, and they just don't look agricultural. They look.
Do they look like the ones on the Philippines?
For rice cultivation? Yeah, they look. Some of them look very much like you'd cultivate rice, but there's no evidence for rice coming in. There's no evidence anywhere in Micronesia of rice as a cultigen. And other than some rice-impressed pottery that you get in Guam. There's been a little of that, but not really any widespread agriculture that includes rice. But I mean, they look remarkably similar, don't they? If you look at the locations of the terraces throughout Palau, they look to be strategic. And there's a pretty good argument that they were the foundations for different clan groups vying for power and political control of territory, and that this finally just sort of dissipated and people began to move to the coast where maybe it was just an easier place to live. But you see this consolidation of power in coastal sites and these stonework villages as well after that time. So at the time of contact, you have 2 major clan groups that control Palau, one in Babeldaub and then one below Babeldaub. And those still exist today. The chiefly titles are still there, and people hold those titles, and they're very serious people to be reckoned with on a political level.
I asked the question, because I don't know whether I saw this correctly from the previous slide, but the picture looked as if the vegetation on the terraces looked very different from the. Do you think there's a reason for that?
Well, there's been a lot of debate about whether that's cultural or natural. Here, I'll just pull this up again. Whoops. These terraces that you see, so you'll notice that a lot of them look bare. They're basically a savanna. You get the occasional pandanus tree scattered around, some bushes every once in a while. But yeah, most of them are bare. And the paleo-environmental data that's been collected from different cores around Palau suggests that it might be humans that are prepping the land for agriculture, that are burning it down to get rid of the vegetation, so they can more easily construct these, and that it just never came back. Although some archaeologists believe a lot of it's just natural. But you do seem to get, right around before construction begins and after, you get increased levels of charcoal particles, which are usually indicative of increased burning activities. But the jury's still out on that, so I'm not quite sure.
Well, I know my stomach is starting to feel like it's time to stop. So, if anybody else is hungry, let's thank Scott one more time.
Okay, thank you.
And don't forget, Anna Roosevelt next Friday. It'll be terrific. Thank you, Scott. That was
Thanks. Yeah, thanks for having me.
There you did it.